My son's wife slapped me, and my own son laughed. That day, I walked away forever, and took everything they had, but it didn't happen in a single heated moment. The events that led up to it had been building for years, slowly and silently. Like cracks forming in a wall, you don't notice until the whole thing gives way. My name is Harold Thompson. I'm 65 years old. I worked 43 years in the same manufacturing plant, waking up at 5 every morning, rain or shine, to make sure my family had a roof over their heads and food on the table. My wife Margaret passed away 10 years ago, and since then, my only son, Daniel, has been the center of my life. Daniel was always bright, ambitious, and charming. He had that spark that made people gravitate toward him. I was proud, so proud when he graduated college and landed a good job. I thought my late wife would have been proud too. I wanted nothing more than to see him happy. When he brought home Emily, the woman he wanted to marry, I welcomed her with open arms. She was polite at first, though there was a sharpness in her eyes I couldn't quite place. I brushed it off as nerves. People need time to warm up, I told myself. They married within a year. At their wedding, I gave a speech about love, patience, and family. I meant every word. But even then, I noticed Emily didn't seem entirely comfortable when I spoke. She smiled for the crowd, but her eyes darted elsewhere. In the years after, I tried to visit them often. I'd bring over groceries sometimes, or freshly baked bread from a bakery near my place. Emily would accept them with a tight smile and a quick thank you, but I could feel a wall between us. I never wanted to get in their way, so I kept my visits. Last year, things changed. I had an accident at work, a minor fall, but enough to leave me with lingering pain in my hip. My doctor suggested I take it easy for a while. I retired earlier than planned. My pension and savings were enough for me to live on comfortably, but the quiet of my small house felt suffocating. Daniel suggested I move in with them for a few months, just until I felt better. I hesitated, but he insisted. Dad, it'll be good for us to spend more time together, he said so. I packed my things and moved into their guest room. At first it went well enough. I stayed out of their way, helped around the house, and made dinner some nights. But I started noticing Emily's annoyance over small things, a dish left in the sink, my shoes by the door, a newspaper on the table. One night, about 2 months after I moved in, I overheard them talking in the kitchen. My room was right down the hall, and the walls weren't thick. I'm tired of him being here all the time, Emily said. Her voice was sharp. He's my dad, Daniel replied. I know, but it's our house. I want our space back. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling. It stung, but I understood. I told myself I'd talk to Daniel about finding my own place. Soon, then came the day everything broke. It was a Sunday afternoon. I had just finished making tea when Emily walked in. She looked frustrated, like she'd been holding something in for too long. Harold, we need to talk, she said. I nodded, setting my cup down. Of course. Her voice rose quickly. She accused me of overstaying, of not respecting boundaries, of making her uncomfortable in her own home. I tried to explain that I had been planning to leave soon, but she didn't want to hear it. And then, in the middle of the argument, she slapped me. It wasn't a light tap. It was sharp, loud, and hot against my cheek. For a second, the world went still. I looked toward the doorway, and there was Daniel. He'd been standing there long enough to hear it all, but instead of stepping forward, instead of defending me, he laughed. It was a short, awkward laugh, but it was there. I stood frozen. The sting on my cheek, nothing compared to the ache in my chest. I felt something inside me break, something that had been holding on through all the little slights, all the awkward silences. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply turned, walked to my room, and began packing my things. Daniel followed me. Dad, wait. It's not what you think, he started. I didn't answer. I gathered my clothes, my watch, the few books I'd brought. I picked up the photo of Margaret from the nightstand, slipped it into my bag, and zipped it shut. Emily stayed in the living room. She didn't apologize. She didn't say a word. Before I left, I stopped by the front door and looked at my son. I spent my whole life giving you everything I could, I said quietly, and today, you showed me how much that mattered to you. He opened his mouth, but I didn't wait for the words. I walked out, got into my car, and drove away. That night, I sat in my empty house, the silence pressing against me. My cheeks still burned faintly, but it was the emptiness in my chest that hurt most. I thought about all the sacrifices, the overtime shifts, the things I went without so Daniel could have more, the nights I stayed up helping him with homework, the mornings I drove him to early practices. I thought about Margaret, how she had always said family was worth any sacrifice. I wondered what she would say if she saw what had happened today. The more I thought about it, the more I realized something. I had built a life for him, but I had also built a dependency, the house he lived in. I had paid the down payment, the car he drove, a gift for me when he got his promotion, the savings he had in the bank, seed money I had given him when he married Emily. Over the years, I had handed him so much, never asking for anything in return. I thought I was helping him, but maybe I was just making it easier for him to forget where it all came from. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, and that's when I made a decision. If they could so easily disrespect me, then they could live without the things I had given them. I reached for the folder where I kept my financial papers. What I did next would change everything for them, and it would be the last gift I ever gave my son. I sat at the kitchen table long after the clock had crossed midnight. The glass of water had gone warm in front of me. Untouched, the folder lay open, the papers neatly stacked, but carrying the weight of decades. I traced my finger over the edges, thinking of every decision I had made to build a life for my son. Mortgages paid off, loans covered, birthdays where I went without so he could have more. It all felt different now. I wasn't angry in the way people imagine rage. Explosive uncontainable. No. Mine was quiet, cold, a stillness that came when you finally saw something for what it really was. I pulled out the deed to their house. Nickly, it was mine. I had bought it years ago when Daniel told me he wanted to start a family but couldn't afford the down payment. He had promised to take over the mortgage payments, but I had refused to put that burden on him. I told him it was a gift, and for years it had stayed in my name. Now, that decision felt like the only thread I had left to pull. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I'd known Richard for over 20 years. He'd helped me settle matters when Margaret passed, and I trusted him. He didn't ask many questions when I told him what I wanted to do. He just sighed softly and said, "If that's the decision you've made, Harold, I'll take care of it." By the end of the week, the paperwork was in motion. Their house, the car, and a few other assets I had quietly given them over the years were being transferred back under my direct control. I wasn't doing it to be cruel, at least. That's what I told myself. I was doing it because I had to remind myself that my worth wasn't something they could laugh at or slap away. It wasn't just about the things I had given, it was about respect. 2 weeks later, I drove back to their place. It felt strange pulling into the driveway, knowing that legally, it was mine again. The curtains in the living room were drawn. I knocked. Emily opened the door. Her eyes narrowed instantly, but she stepped aside without a word. Daniel was in the living room, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands. When he looked up, I saw the weight of the last few weeks on his face. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I walked in slowly, setting an envelope on the coffee table. "This," I said, "is notice. You have 30 days to leave the house." Emily's mouth opened, ready to unleash something sharp, but Daniel reached over and gripped her wrist. "Why?" he asked quietly. I met his eyes. "You know why?" The silence stretched between us, heavy and unmovable. I could feel Emily's anger radiating, but Daniel's gaze stayed locked on mine. "You're taking everything?" he asked. "Everything I gave?" I corrected. His shoulders slumped. I have expected him to argue, to call me cruel, to try and guilt me, but instead, he just nodded. Emily stood abruptly, storming into the kitchen, muttering under her breath. I didn't follow her. I didn't care to hear it. Daniel and I sat there for a moment longer. "I thought we were better than this," he finally said. I let out a humorless laugh. So did I. I left without another word. Driving home, I thought about the boy he used to be, the one who would run into my arms after school, showing me his latest drawing, the one who cried on my shoulder when his dog died, the one who for years looked at me like I was his hero. Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared, or maybe I had just stopped seeing him. In the following days, I started sorting through my own life. The house was quiet, but not in the same suffocating way it had been before. It was a quiet I was choosing now. I went through old boxes, finding letters Margaret had written me, photos of Daniel when he was little, and a few trinkets I had forgotten about. Each one carried a memory. Some made me smile, others made my chest ache. A week before their move-out deadline, Daniel showed up at my door. He looked tired, his clothes a little rumpled. I let him in without a word. We sat at the table, the same one where I'd made my decision weeks ago. "Dad," he started, "I know I've messed up." I waited. "I should have stood up for you that day." I don't know why I laughed. Maybe it was nerves. Maybe I just didn't want to believe what I was seeing. His eyes were glassy now. "But you leaving like this? It feels like you're cutting me out of your life completely." I stayed silent for a long time. "I'm not cutting you out, Daniel," I said finally. "I'm teaching you a lesson I should have taught you years ago." He nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. "Emily didn't come with him." I didn't ask why. When he left, I felt the smallest flicker of something regret. Maybe, but it was buried under too much else to name. The day they moved out, I didn't go to the house. I didn't want to watch them pack their lives into boxers. Instead, I went to the park where I used to take Daniel when he was little. I sat on the same bench, watching kids run and laugh. One boy tripped and fell, and his father rushed over, lifting him up and brushing off the dirt. I felt something twist in my chest. I wondered if Daniel remembered all the times I did the same for him. That night, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "We're out. House is yours." Nothing more. I stared at the screen for a long time before setting it face down. In the days that followed, I went back to the house. It was empty. Echoing their scent lingered faintly in the rooms, but the life had gone out of it. I walked through each room slowly, my footsteps hollow against the hardwood floors. In what had been their bedroom, I found a single framed photo on the floor. It was of Daniel, younger, grinning with his arm around me at his college graduation. I picked it up, running my thumb over the glass. For a moment, my resolve wavered. but then I remembered the sting on my cheek, the sound of his laugh. I set the photo down and walked out. I didn't lock the door behind me. I didn't need to. The house wasn't my home. It was just an empty building now. And yet, I knew this wasn't the end of the story. There were still words left unsaid, and one day, they would be spoken. It had been a week since I last stepped into that empty house. The air there had felt stale, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I hadn't gone back. Instead, I stayed in my own home, trying to piece together what life looked like now. The truth was, I didn't know. Every day followed a quiet patterned coffee in the morning, a slow walk through the neighborhood, a meal for one. I told myself this peace was what I had wanted, but peace can be heavy when there's no one to share it with. One afternoon, while I was sorting through some old boxes in the garage, I found something I hadn't seen in years. It was a small wooden box, worn at the corners, with a brass latch that still worked smoothly. Inside were mementos, Margaret's handwriting on yellowed paper, Daniel's old report cards, a ticket stub from the first baseball game I ever took him to. There was also a Father's Day card I had made in kindergarten. The letters were crooked, the drawing a mess of colors, but at the top, in shaky letters, it said, "To the best dad ever." I held it for a long time. The memory of him running up to me with that card, beaming with pride, came rushing back. That little boy had loved me without question. Where had that gone? I set the box aside, unable to throw any of it away. The next morning, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't Daniel. It was Emily. For a moment we just stared at each other. She looked different, tired, maybe even worn down. "Can I come in?" she asked. I hesitated but stepped aside. We sat at the table, the same one where Daniel and I had spoken last. She didn't waste time. "I came to apologize," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes didn't meet mine. "For the slap, for how I spoke to you, for everything." I stayed silent. She shifted in her seat. "I was angry that you were here. I felt like I had no space in my own home. But that doesn't excuse what I did. It was wrong." Her words didn't erase the memory. They didn't take away the sting I had felt, but they were words I hadn't expected. "I appreciate you saying that," I said finally. She nodded, glancing toward the window. "Not doing well. He misses you. He doesn't say it outright, but I can tell. I think he's ashamed." I looked down at my hands. "He should be." There was a pause. "I'm not asking you to give back the house or the car," she said quietly. "I'm asking you to talk to him, please, before it's too late." The words hung in the air. When she left, I sat there for a long time, staring at the door. That night, I lay awake thinking. I wasn't sure what too late meant, but I knew I didn't want to find out. 2 days later, I drove to the apartment complex where Daniel and Emily were living now. It wasn't in a bad part of town, but it was smaller, older. When Daniel opened the door, surprise flashed across his face. "Dad, can I come in?" He stepped aside. The place was neat, but sparse. A couch, a coffee table, a small TV. No framed photos on the walls. We sat in the living room, the hum of the fridge filling the silence. "I heard you're not doing well," I said. He looked down, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Emily told you that, didn't she?" "She did." He sighed. "I've been thinking about that day, about everything I should have done differently." His voice cracked slightly. "I don't know why I laughed. I think I was embarrassed, shocked, and instead of protecting you, I just stood there like a coward." I studied him for a moment. "I raised you better than that. I know." There was no defensiveness in his tone, just quiet acceptance. We sat there for a long time without speaking. Finally he said, "I miss Mom." The words hit me in a place I hadn't been ready for. "I do too," I said softly. "She wouldn't have wanted this." He said, "No," I admitted. "She wouldn't have." It was the first time in a long while that I felt like I was talking to my son, not the man who had laughed that day, but the boy who used to run to me when he was hurt. I didn't forgive him right there. Some wounds don't close in a single conversation. But something shifted. When I left, he walked me to the door. We didn't hug, but as I stepped out, he said, "Thank you for coming." A week passed before I saw him again. This time, he showed up at my place with a box. "These are yours," he said, setting it on the table. Inside were some of the things I had given him over the years, an old watch of mine, a set of tools, a leather wallet Margaret had bought me decades ago. "I don't want you to think I took you for granted," he said quietly. I looked at the box, then at him. "I don't need these back, Daniel. I know, but I need to give them to you." We shared coffee that morning. It was awkward, but there was a thread of something familiar between us. Not trust yet, not forgiveness, but maybe the start of it. After he left, I sat at the table, turning the old watch over in my hands. The ticking was steady, unchanged. Time was still moving forward, whether we were ready or not. That night, I thought about the house again. It was still sitting there, empty. I had no plans to sell it, but I also couldn't bring myself to live in it. It was too full of ghosts. Still, something told me that house would play a role in whatever came next. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but the story between me and my son wasn't finished. Not yet. The days were growing shorter, the light fading earlier with each passing evening. I found myself sitting by the window most nights, watching the last orange glow sink behind the rooftops. The world outside kept moving, but my own days felt suspended half lived. I had taken so much from Daniel and Emily, yet the empty house still lingered in my mind, like an unanswered question. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of every choice I had made for them, and every choice I had now taken back. One morning, I drove past it. The curtains were still drawn, the mailbox stuffed with flyers. A thin layer of dust coated the steps. It looked abandoned, in a way that felt different from when they had left. As I sat there in my car, I realized I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it. Keeping it felt like holding on to a wound that refused to close. Selling it felt like erasing a chapter before I had read the last page. I drove on without deciding. A week later, Daniel called. It was the first time in months he had called without Emily's voice somewhere in the background. "Dad," he said, "I was wondering if we could meet, just us." His voice sounded tentative, like he wasn't sure if I'd say yes. I agreed. We met at a small diner off the highway, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that never ran out. When I walked in, he was already there, hands wrapped around a mug, staring into the steam. He stood when he saw me. We sat for a while. We just drank our coffee in silence. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately," he said. "So have I replied. "She always believed in second chances," he continued, his eyes fixed on the table. I let that hang in the air. He took a breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me yet. I don't know if I've earned that, but I want to try. I want us to try." There was no performance in his voice, no defensiveness, just a quiet sincerity. I hadn't heard from him in years. "I don't know what trying looks like," I admitted. "Maybe it's just having coffee together every week," he suggested. "Maybe it's fixing something small before we even think about the big things." I studied him for a moment. He wasn't asking for the house back. He wasn't asking for money. He was just asking for time, and I found myself willing to give him that. "All right," I said. His shoulders eased, as if he'd been holding his breath. We talked for another hour about work, about the weather, about nothing that really mattered but somehow still did. When we parted, he said, "See you next week." "Next week," I confirmed, and I meant it. Those weekly coffees became a quiet ritual. Sometimes Emily came along, sometimes she didn't. When she did, she was polite, careful with her words. I remained civil, though I still carried the memory of that day. The wound wasn't gone, but it was no longer fresh. One afternoon, during one of our coffees, Daniel asked, "What are you going to do with the house?" I shrugged. "Haven't decided." "You could rent it out," he said. "I could," I replied. But we both knew the house was more than just property to me. It was the place where trust had broken, and maybe one day it could be the place where something was rebuilt. Weeks passed then. Out of nowhere, Daniel called me on a rainy evening. "Dad, Emily's pregnant." I sat there, the phone warm in my hand, not sure how to respond. It was news that, years ago, would have filled me with pure joy. Now, it was tangled with everything else we hadn't yet resolved. "That's big news," I said finally. "It is," he agreed. "And I want my kid to know you." "Really know you?" The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. "We'll see," I said softly. In the days after, I thought about what that meant. A grandchild, a new branch on the family tree, the chance to be part of a life untouched by the bitterness of the past. The thought stirred something in me I hadn't felt in years, a cautious hope. One Sunday morning, I drove to the house again. This time, I got out. I walked through each room, imagining what it might look like, filled with laughter again. Not Daniel's laughter from that day, but the kind of laughter that builds, not breaks. I didn't make a decision that day, but I knew the house wasn't done with me, and I wasn't done with it. Whatever came next, the story wasn't over, not by a long shot. The weeks that followed moved at their own quiet pace. I kept my coffee meetings with Daniel, watching as his tone softened, his eyes meeting mine more often. He had begun asking questions about my childhood, my parents, my first job, things he had never thought to ask before. It was strange, the way we were learning about each other after decades of being father and son. Emily remained cautious around me, her politeness measured. But as her pregnancy progressed, I noticed small changes, her voice warmer, her smile less forced. Perhaps the child she carried was softening her too. One evening, Daniel invited me to their apartment. It was the first time I had stepped inside since everything happened. The place was modest, far smaller than the house they had lost, but it was tidy, warm, and smelled faintly of cinnamon. Emily greeted me at the door. "Come in," she said, her voice gentle. Daniel took my coat, and for a moment, it almost felt like a family visit from years past. We sat at the table, eating stew Emily had made. The conversation was easy, flowing in a way I hadn't expected. When she spoke about the baby, there was a light in her eyes that even I couldn't ignore. After dinner, Daniel brought out an old photo album. "Thought you might like to show Emily some of these," he said. I opened the pages, the images pulling me into another time. There I was, holding a much younger Daniel on my shoulders. There was his mother, smiling at us from behind the camera. Emily leaned in closer, studying the pictures. "You to look so much alike," she said softly. I wasn't sure if she meant it as a bridge or just an observation, but either way, it felt like a step as the months passed. The tension continued to ease. When Emily went into labor, Daniel called me. From the hospital, Dad. She's here, he said, his voice breaking. I could hear the newborn's faint cries in the background. Do you want to meet her? I didn't hesitate. At the hospital, I stood outside the glass window of the nursery, looking at the tiny life, swaddled in pink. Daniel came to stand beside me. Her name's Grace, he said. I nodded, my throat tight. Grace. It felt like a name that carried a kind of forgiveness I didn't yet know how to give myself. Holding her for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. Her small fingers wrapped around mine, her eyes blinking against the light. She didn't know about that terrible day. She didn't care about the past. To her, I was just a pair of arms holding her steady. And in that moment, I realized I wanted to be that for her, not just now, but always. In the months that followed, I became a regular presence in their lives. Sunday, lunches, walks in the park, helping with groceries. There were still moments when the past crept in, small reminders of the pain we'd all carried, but they no longer held the same weight. Daniel never asked for the house back. I never offered. But one spring afternoon, as we sat on a park bench watching Grace sleep in her stroller, I said, I've been thinking about the house. He looked at me, waiting. I might not live there again, I continued, but maybe it could be Grace's one day, if you'd want that. Daniel's eyes softened. That would mean a lot, Dad, he said quietly. We didn't speak much after that. We just sat there listening to the wind in the trees, the distant laughter of children playing. For the first time in a long time, I felt something like peace. It wasn't the peace of forgetting, it was the peace of knowing that while the past couldn't be erased, the future could still be shaped. Grace stirred in her sleep, her tiny hand curling into a fist. I reached out and adjusted the blanket around her. Daniel watched me, then smiled, a small, unforced smile that felt like an unspoken truce. I returned it. The road back to family hadn't been straight, it hadn't been easy, but it was ours. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, I knew the story wasn't ending here. It was simply moving into a new chapter, one we would write together.